Hello, my name is Kuba Kucharski and this is the Dev Team Project, a podcast exploring methods, approaches and skills needed to build great engineering teams. So let's be starting.
Yeah.
And welcome everyone. This is another episode of the Dev Team Project. This time our guest is Karissa McKelvey, founding member of that foundation and engineering manager there. Karissa has loads of experience with managing volunteer engineers and growing open source ecosystems. And this is why I would like to make this episode about open source and managing open source engineering teams. But let's start with your background.
Yeah, so I actually got my background started in research. So I was a PhD student and I was working on data science and complex systems. Mm-hmm. And then I dropped out and started realizing that there's bigger issues in internet infrastructure that we need to be addressing. And I got started, I did a little stint at Google and some startups, and then I got started with DAT protocol when it was just three of us. And then we grew to 8 over time. I helped raise $1.5 million, and we grew the team to 8. And then we also started seeing a load of community development and engineers just volunteering their time to the protocol and to the surrounding ecosystem of tools. And now we have 30 or 40 partners or organizations using the code, and it's uncountable how many volunteers we have at this point. Yeah. It's really hard to actually have insight into that sometimes, but we have a good handle on all the volunteers, and I do a lot of that work and coordinating and making cooperation happen between the folks.
But can we say a rough number of engineers working on a project right now?
So I'd say we have about 20 engineers that are focused on the consortium, and they're representing even larger organizations. So you could say 100 or 120 people, I'd say, in the ecosystem diaspora that are actually contributing in some way to the ecosystem, and even more closer knit group is about 20 of us.
So what is that foundation like?
That foundation is like a nonprofit that's it's a thin layer over the engineering that's going on in open source for the protocol. It's a distributed ledger technology, and people donate to the foundation, and we give grants to folks who are contributing to the protocol as well as the tools that sit on top of the protocol. And people use the protocol to sync data sets over a peer-to-peer network. So we took some ideas from BitTorrent and from Git and put them together in a distributed ledger. And so instead of data getting slower as you download it, it gets faster as more people enter.
Because with BitTorrent, it will be slow and it wouldn't be able to handle big data.
Yeah, that's part of it. So BitTorrent is really amazing. It's probably the biggest and most popular peer-to-peer technology that we know of. It has some issues though, and one of those issues is it's really good with static files that never change. So you see people pirating movies and that sort of thing in music. But if you want to actually change data over time, the URL of that, or the hash of that data changes, so you can't efficiently update data over time. So that solves that particular issue of mutating data over a peer-to-peer network. So yeah.
It's really like Git on BitTorrent, right?
Yeah. I think it was part of the motivation is taking some of the best ideas from Git, so having the distributed ledger aspect and adding a peer-to-peer network to it.
And so who uses it? What are the use cases there?
A lot of applications are in places where people need data offline. So one of the biggest use cases that I've been involved in is called Map.io, which is a mapping and monitoring tool for indigenous people and marginalized communities who want to map their territories. A lot of this information happens offline. So information collection happens offline. There's surveillance concerns. They don't want to give their data up to a third party. And if they do give their data to a third party, they want to have control over which data points. So for them, it's about cooperative ownership and management of their data. So other places we've seen this is in university settings. So scientists want to cooperatively own and manage the data that they're collaborating on, and they also don't want to necessarily have to depend on a third-party service for many years and pay like an Amazon or a Dropbox for many years for a service. It also prevents link rot. So in cases where you want to link to something and want to have that be a persistent identifier over time, so say in a scientific paper, you can ensure that that hash will be the same. And even if you add data changes later on, you can see those edits that were happening and what time they were edited, have an audit trail of those edits. Whereas like an HTTP link, you kind of just get the latest thing that was there, and you linked it in a paper 5 years ago, you have no idea what it is, or the link to just be 404 and totally gone. So that is looking to solves these two problems, primarily in science and with technology that needs to worry about surveillance or having cooperative ownership of data.
But I can see that with all those privacy features that this could be useful, like for probably even like enterprise companies.
Yeah, I think. Oh yeah. So in some ways, people are working on cryptographic key sharing within enterprise. So there's a group called Hyperdivision that's working on that. And you can imagine anytime you want cooperatively owned and shared data inside an enterprise, that would be something useful. You can also create some intranets and have the data be shared only internally, that kind of thing. It's also very resilient. So for an enterprise use case or in a disaster use case, you want to see where data doesn't go offline just because a server goes down. You want to be able to have resilient backups and copies of it.
So we could set up like kind of like an anti-fragile setup for any like organization that might need that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I want to move into open source models of how the organizations are working out there. And I've seen like a lot of those models. There are like huge organizations like Linux kernel that used to be oriented around a single contributor, but things changed a lot.
Yeah.
And now it's it's like a battlefield of many companies and many incentives there. There are ones that really depend heavily on central contributors. Still, it's like a point of failure there, because if this contributor walks away or something happens to him, like we have a problem with this open source project. So I wonder, like, what do you see there? What kind of open source models for engineering teams you see out there?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because people also, like the Cathedral and the Bazaar paper, which you might be familiar with, attributes the success of the Linux kernel to this exact thing, which is you have very dispersed sets of modules where each person is in, kind of ownership of this one particular module, and they're able to move forward and interop with other people. So that was like, in some ways, the way that it moved quickly. But I do think that there are organizations like Mozilla that have taken a similar approach. They have like a module owner concept, but then they have a process by which you can easily switch to a different owner in the case that the module owner, for some reason, is not working on the project anymore or moves away or to a different project. So I think that there are still governance aspects, and in open source we're pushing this idea of governance, and how can you think about the governance of your project from an early state, so you can reduce these kinds of, maybe not reduce the dependencies immediately, but over time reduce the failure of a dependency. So I don't think that there's necessarily a bad thing to have a dependency on a particular person, but you have to have a governance use case where what happens if that person is no longer able to continue. You have to have some ways of moving forward. And I think places like foundations and community groups the structures are there in order to provide support for that and to easily transition to new forms of being over time. And I think I like to think of it as a new beginnings, like many new beginnings of projects, and that keeps things going, and it also encourages engineers. For example, if you have a module owner who has lots of people depending on them, it's very good for their career. And so that motivates people to contribute more and because everything is open, everyone can see what they're working on. So I think there is a healthy push and pull that we can have with this this dynamic.
But it's like formalizing, you know, this project like into the foundation or building this tiny layer out there. It's like, is it the only recipe for taking care of this governance or building the governance system?
No, I mean, you could have just totally ungoverned, which is
that's not governance, right?
No, but I think that there are places that there are companies. So you have a company who's doing actually most of the development of a particular project, and it's actually mostly the company that's controlling the project. I think there's also been new ways of people talking about in the blockchain community of like giving like little pieces of cash to folks who do contributions and trying to distribute funds in a different way. That's with like Gitcoin and things like that. But yeah, I think that having some sort of consortium or at least a group and that has some model of communication between the folks. I mean, we talk about coordination is like the base layer, at least like, people from the heads of the different organizations are able to talk to each other. Also you could call it in activism, you call it like a spokes model. And then coordinations, that's like a base layer, that's like where we want to be. And I don't think it matters what the legal entity necessarily is. Although I do think that when a company comes in and buys their way into that coordination body, that can lead to the project becoming really more a project for that particular company's use case. So I think it's important in those groups to have like a variety of voices. And that's, I think, where like a nonprofit or like a community-based space can help with that and try to mediate all the concerns between the different organizations. Postgres actually has some bylaws where you have only like 2 people from any organization can be in the consortium. You can have different rules.
2 people from one organization in the whole consortium.
Yeah, you can't have like 20 people from Google and like 2 people from
Netflix. And they get like equal votes or something like this, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea would be not have any one interest control the group.
Is there a place where people can learn about this process of building governance for open source projects? Do you recommend anything?
Honestly, there's been some really good work from Nadia Eghbal about open source sustainability, and she wrote a really long report, and I think she's also working on a book, and I really like her work. She interviewed a lot of open source groups. I would first look there, and then maybe she's cited things as well that you could go into the rabbit hole.
And I have in my head this ideal, really sociocratic team that is that's really doing well out there, but I cannot name the actual project. Like, what is like the best implementation of governance for an open source project that you've seen so far?
I think it just depends on people, how the project started and the people that are involved. I think you can I think that we're always getting better. Like, engineering as a whole is very like male and white dominated, especially Silicon Valley. So I think we're getting better as a community in bringing in more voices. But yeah, I think that if you just look back in time, you're only going to see more and more of this like homogeneous like groups of the same kind of people doing the same kind of things. And I think right now we're in a flux where there's more movement, and so I'm really excited to see what's happening in the next 20 years or so with this.
And so we can move on to this part when we talk about open source and money, because we know that money is important, like, to sustain projects because people are spending time on them. But at the same time, I heard some opinions that paying people actually ruins their incentive to work on a project sometimes. Have you seen things like that?
So yeah, I think people work in open source, especially in sort of like a in a Unix bazaar style where everyone's working on their own little corner. I think people do this and they volunteer because they're excited about whatever little piece of thing that they're working on, and maybe that's something they want to use in a personal project or for their company or whatever, but there's some thing that's motivating them to volunteer on this particular thing. And that like intrinsic desire to work on something and volunteer on something is really precious and special. And I think honoring that is important. Whereas when you have like a company who's paying people to contribute to something, sometimes that is there. Sometimes people are intrinsically motivated to do a thing or have passion about a particular part of it. But often people they're doing it to survive in this world, this capitalist world, and trying to, have healthcare and support for long term. So I think, there is a dynamic that is entered when money becomes a part of the conversation, where and it's not necessarily always a bad thing, but it does change the conversation. So what I've been interested in is figuring out how we can support the volunteers that already exist and help them do things they already want to do. And I think right now most of that is self-selected. So someone will go, there's lots of people who just volunteer their time all the time, and you see that they're volunteering, and then you reach out to them and you're like, oh, hey, you've self-selected into this and I want to help you. But I think there's lots of other people that may be in companies that want to contribute or want to volunteer, or maybe don't have the time to do that. And money can help give them that agency to contribute. It's a matter of helping them and finding them. One of the ways that people have done this, which I have mixed feelings about, but I think it's a good step. It's a step in the right direction, are things like Open Collective, where you can, as a contributor, invoice to the donation pool and say, I want to do this work, and give me $200 or $400 to do this particular work, or get coin like I mentioned before, or just micro grants, like SSB has this micro grants program where you can get $1,000 or $4,000 to do a particular thing. But I think paying people and honoring people for that work is valuable. I do think we have to be careful, though, and this is, where it can taint things, is like if someone is doing things just for the money all the time, and just for a particular business use case, which has economic incentives, there are negatives to that, which is that people in activism or nonprofit use cases, or people who are doing things that maybe don't make money, like we have this problem in capitalism more generally, like teachers aren't paid enough, nurses or whatever. So just because something is valuable for business use case doesn't mean it's not valuable generally. And I think this is the kind of fabric that we're working with in open source, is trying to value all the things all the contributions that are happening, not just the business cases that people want to pay for.
Yeah, I think this money issue gets really important when someone starts to work on some open source project, like really full time or close to the full time, or as like a project coordinator. And it's like, it really makes sense to fund the project sometimes, to make sure that it will go through, and you can make sure that this person gets some kind of stability in their life, for the work they're doing.
Yeah, that's why I really like things like Open Collective, or we have the nonprofit Code for Science and Society, and Spiral, which is another nonprofit based in New Zealand. These kinds of containers where people can donate money to a nonprofit, and then, or the nonprofit gets grants or some sort of in-kind contributions from companies, and then can give that money to people who are doing good work and want to continue certain projects that are important, like project management or event coordination and things like that, where you might need to hire an expert to help with you with that sort of thing. So
okay, I'm glad we discussed the money. I would like to talk now about how to get people out there to help you on your open source project. Do you have any recipes here?
I would say going to conferences and giving a talk, and at the end saying like, if you want to
getting
help,
out there, meeting
just really
people,
talking to people.
Okay.
Yeah, that's been really valuable for us at DAT, and just getting face-to-face time. I think in a traditional company that requires everybody to be on site, this is like taken for granted, but in open source, everyone's all over the world. So getting face-to-face time and, you know, reaching new audiences through face-to-face interactions and can really build the word of mouth and the trust that you need to have people want to contribute.
Is the mission like helpful? You know, like that foundation, that protocol are cool things, helping nonprofit companies, solving like problems for people. Does it help with attracting contributors for the project?
Definitely. We get a lot of contributors who, I mean, this is part of the volunteer aspect, who want to contribute because they're passionate about it. And I think it's not just the nonprofit side of things, but it's also, you know, values, cooperation and mutual respect and like non-hierarchical organization styles. And this kind of also brings in the bazaar style organization where you can build something and interop with other tools, but it's not necessarily coordinated from the top down 100% of the time. And I think this is very different, and it encourages people to be excited to actually get involved because they know that their contribution could be valuable to someone at some point. I do think it's important to have like really good tech or cool tech, and we do things like read academic papers and implement them, and that is something that gets people excited who are mid-level or advanced in their careers to contribute extra time off work because it's just cutting edge and interesting.
Okay, so now I got someone excited about my project. I need to onboard them, and I must admit, like I started several like small projects that were like public on GitHub, and I attracted people to help me with them, but I failed with like onboarding them into the whole flow process of cooperating on this project. I probably siloed the information about the code and things like that.
Honestly, it's not that much different than engineering management in a corporation or whatever at this point, because it's like you want a good readmes, good documentation. Hello, like you're new to this community. Like here's like so we have a docs page. A lot of open source projects have this where it's like this is all things you need to know. And then, that's the first thing you send people to. And you can also invite them to community calls. So we have a community call every 2 weeks that anyone can join and just ask questions. We also have an IRC channel where the core developers who've been around for a long time, who know a lot, are there and open for questions. People don't always, I think there's a lot of people in that channel, so it can, IRC channels can sometimes vary off into other discussions like philosophy or whatever, but that's also part of the excitement of being part of a community that is really talking. The same thing happens in companies as well. You have like an off-topic channel where people are discussing what they ate for lunch or whatever. So I think like having, I don't think it's actually that different than other kinds of organizations.
I think now we have this thing that remote first got so trendy, and for me, this was always the case with open source software.
Right.
Yeah, we were always remote first.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed that companies that are, like remote first are doing, they're like meeting those people like once a year or twice a year, for example.
Yep, that's important.
It's important, but probably not very affordable for most of the open source projects.
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
So community calls would be a solution.
Yeah.
Like any.
It's similar to like an all hands in a company. They might do it every week or something where everyone's in the same place at the same time. In a community call, it's kind of optional. And I think part of that is also getting other people involved who may or may not know that much about what's going on or just want to or people who might have to contribute something very specific. So that's kind of cool because anyone can come and talk. But we also do have also regular calls with folks who are have been more engaged, who want to coordinate. And also there's lots of one-on-one calls that happen, and that's part of also my work as someone who's been around a long time and does a lot of community engagement and volunteer management, is just checking in on everybody and saying, hey, what are you up to lately?
I wonder if one day we get more like VR adoption, that VR meetings for open source projects would become a thing.
One of the people in our community is working on that.
Oh, cool! So at last, I need to talk to them then.
Yeah, Ranger Mauve.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, do you have any advices for people that are starting open source projects, already have something out there and want to grow the community, scale the project?
I'd say open source from the first commit. It's very scary, especially from people coming from corporate or startup environments, but the value is huge.
Okay.
So when people can see your work over time, you actually do better work, and you're more encouraged to make things in the way that you want them to be seen by other people. It also encourages contributions from an early stage. And I think people have a misconception that contributions are going to be, it's a lot to handle in terms of there's going to be 100 issues in the first day, and I don't know. But actually, I think people usually overestimate the amount of people are actually paying attention, and I think it's a good way to snowball your way gradually into something that's more popular by open sourcing on the first commit. So that's the first mistake I see people make. Another thing I'd say is writing really good documentation. I think people overlook this often, but it's really more of I would say more of a general thing in engineering. But in open source is even more critical because everybody's looking at it, and it also reduces dependency on you to answer questions from people who want to come in. So if you write a good README once, and some good docs in the code, then you're going to get fewer questions and fewer issues because people will be like, oh, I understand that. I'm just going to write a PR to fix it. I'm going to contribute directly in something I don't really understand what's going on here. Okay, now I have to ask. And then that actually it's like putting in the upfront time to do documentation so that later you get more time for yourself.
And do people read documentation? My favorite quote is that shared documentation is not the same as shared understanding. Is there anything better out there than just plain text file?
No.
No.
I think that though, having links, the permalinks in the readmes and the docs, so you can, someone asks a question, you can just link to the FAQ that is in the FAQ. You don't have to type out the same answer, So those little shortcuts can improve your response time.
That's what I thought. Just still state of the art is the text documentation. And this is what we have.
Yeah. Another thing that people do is they add collaborators directly to the repository, so people don't have to fork the repository and then make a pull request, but they can just make a pull request within, and that's a pretty cool tactic as well. And inviting people to collaborate directly on the code and not being afraid of people stamping on your stuff. I think that was one of the things that Unix did really well, and also I hear Tesla does really well, but just to give two extreme examples, just merging stuff and just accepting a lot of collaborators, and we're going to move quickly, but also having good releases that in betas, so you're moving quickly but you're not breaking things. So people think you move fast and break things, but you actually move fast and then make sure things work. Also, you don't always have to break things just because you're moving fast. But I think that's the sweet spot.
Okay. So let's talk about commercial engineering teams working on open source project and this cooperation between open source projects and commercial teams. And you already mentioned one model, which is company that is doing, for example, some kind of dual licensing model. Like they lead the open source project, but they have their own way of releasing it and selling it to the enterprises, for example. So that's one model.
Yeah.
What else is out there?
I think that's actually the state of the art I've seen. So one of the anecdotes I have from this is that when I was first getting into JavaScript and Node and open source, I met someone who had built a tool that everybody uses. People in engineering departments in Google probably use it. And he had broken his arm and he couldn't go to the doctor because he didn't have health insurance. But all these Fortune 500 companies were using his code. So I started realizing, that was 5 years ago, I realized oh man, there's a serious issue where someone who's as prolific as him is not able to get licenses sold to these companies and not able to make a business out of his code. And so there's people like License Zero that are working on this. Kyle Mitchell from License Zero, really smart up-and-coming lawyer in the space, where you can license your code as have a free license, and then also have another license that's for enterprise deployments, or people who are using some number of users or more. Then you fall into this other license where you have to buy it in order to use the code, but it would still be free and open source for folks who are just individual contributors or small organizations that are just using it off the shelf, that probably also don't have that much money to pay for a license. So it's really targeted at these larger companies. And I think we don't have very much visibility into who is using our code in open source. I think NPM and other package managers are trying to do better at that, but there's lots of granular information that would be useful. I think GitHub is also trying to do some stuff with the sponsored projects program. I do think that there needs to be more push. Would be really curious to see how new languages like Rust are going to handle this issue going forward, because there's a lot of potential.
Because they're new. I think there was a recent case, like a very heated discussion on Hacker News about curl. Like everyone is using curl. Like there's probably on hundreds of millions of devices all over the world, and all the companies out there are using curl in their code deployments, things like that. And this person that is working on curl, he gets nothing from it. And the discussion was because he got $60,000 from Uber or something like this, and people were really angry that this is just $60,000 from one company. And
I think it's at that point it's a matter of donations, right? We don't really have good structures yet totally penetrated into the space or saturated. So we're still relying on donations.
And with little tools, it's fairly simple, but sometimes with our products, we engineers, we rely on some projects that are open source. There was a famous case of RethinkDB. It was really cool database, and a lot of people started to implement RethinkDB, and then the company went out of business completely. And I think the code was somehow passed to some foundation, Apache Foundation, I'm not sure. But still, this project is dead, and there is no new commits. And for a thing like database, it's something that really needs to grow. And I wonder, is there a way to to protect yourself from
People
this
do this. I
direction?
mean, they make companies and they close source their code and they patent it.
Yeah.
I think there's the growing movement is to think beyond patents and closed source code. I mean, that's just that's the dilemma is there's so much value being brought to companies from collaboration between engineers, and seeing that value and understanding that companies participating in open source is a good thing, or can be a good thing, and trying to mitigate the negative side effects of this, I think would be beneficial for everyone. Companies that are closed source and also all the open source contributors. It's a commons space, and the value of the commons is when people coordinate and collaborate over that. And I think we're still trying to get there. I think stuff like the parity license from License Zero is a really good step in the right direction. If we can have better structures and easier ways for companies to be held accountable and contribute, and also for people to start their own companies. And I think it's still intractable often for software developers who are really, they're technical, and the best ones are really, highly focused on their technical work, to then also start a company at the same time. So figuring out ways to reduce that overhead for these software contributors is something that I think companies should be interested in. So yeah, I don't know.
So if I lead an engineering team and I want to choose a project that to implement, there's obvious things that I need to look on, like whether this code is okay, whether I need this feature, whether licensing is fine. But are there specific things that I should be looking into as far as the health of this open source project is concerned?
Other things
like the structure, maybe amount of people contributing. I know that might be
I got you.
From case to case, but I wonder can we give any advices here?
Yeah, I just wrote an open source checklist for government folks. The idea, I think it would be also similar for companies looking to adopt open source. You have to have someone on your team that's willing to maintain and update, even if it's only a day, a week, or less, but at least checking in on that open source project and being the owner of that collaboration you have with that open source project. I think this was one of the biggest mistakes of the Heartbleed incident, and is that people just depended on this technology, OpenSSL, and then they don't look at it ever again, and they don't have anyone who's keeping tabs on it or making sure. So having someone on your team who, even if it's just an hour a day or hour a week, is looking at this open source project and making sure we're and in some cases you might need to write a PR or a pull request, or do contributions yourself as a company, and you have to be prepared for that. And I think that's a good thing. And you're also going to get contributions from other companies, and this is where the common code is going to be valuable for you. I think there's also people are really excited about using new projects. They're like, oh, this is a new project, it just had commits yesterday, and I'm like, maybe you want to see what stage a project is in, and make sure that it has some stable releases that have happened. Otherwise, you also need to be prepared to contribute directly to the project yourself. I think people are really always looking for the new shiny thing, and
they do, especially engineers. But this is the sort of advices that I was looking for. And we're slowly running out of time, so I would like to wrap up with the last question. So what do you think those engineering teams out there can learn from open source projects?
There's different types of coordination and ways of working together. So you have coordination, which is what companies usually do. You have leads that coordinate, and then they tell their subordinates, and then they tell their subordinates, and it's this coordinated system. I think that's pretty good, but I think trying to get to a cooperative system where people are at all levels are actually engaging with each other, and it's more of a less hierarchical and more horizontal of a system. It empowers engineers, and it gives them more flexibility and excitement to take risks and also bring value to the product that you're building. This is something that Unix and the Bazaar style, has taught us over time, that you can build really solid in technology through this sort of like evolution of technologies over time, with multiple players taking ownership of multiple things. So you can see it as like a survival of fittest of these like modules that are kind of like competing, and I think that's the way they describe it in Cathedral and Bazaar. It's like an evolution of technology rather than a coordinated military style system or cathedral style system of technology. So I think listening to engineers and helping them succeed in the goals that they have set for themselves and for the technology, and empowering them to learn about what's new and what's going on and new approaches, and helping them take those risks will make them more productive and more excited about what they're working on. So loosening control and trusting people, that's something you have to take for granted, open source, and something that we should also be doing in business.
I think it's a wonderful note to end on, and thank you for taking the time to be here with me and be the guest of the DevTeam project.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Yeah.